So today I am joined, I'm very excited actually, it's been a while to try and get Sravana and Anya back on the podcast, and they have a really interesting new book to talk about, Kundalini Yoga and the History of Experience. So every time I fluff that last bit of the title. Anyway, it's a wonderful book, and really, as I always say, I only recommend the books on the podcast that an average person can read. So both of you are doctors in fact, aren't you? And are both academics, but this is really, a very much, generally speaking, aimed at the layperson. Anyone can read it, even I read it. I really enjoyed it. It's obviously a subject that we really enjoy these days, Kundalini Yoga, mysterious force in the body. And so, super excited to have you both on. Thanks for coming on again.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you, Adam.
Yes, and it's a three-person, like me, Sravana and Anya. And so, we don't do this format often. So I thought, well, the obvious way to start is just maybe just introduce both of our guests. And both of you have done podcasts with me before, so you can look at audience back on those podcasts, the single ones that I've done, and they've agreed, sillily enough, to come on another podcast with me. So welcome both of you, and I suppose just maybe just a couple of words, Anya and Sravana, on your backgrounds and how you got together to write the book together. It would be lovely.
Yeah, so Sravana, I think, actually approached me with the idea for this book about 7-8 years ago now. My background is in mostly this intersection of South Asian and what I call kind of Western harmonial traditions. And so I had done a lot of research on modern postural yoga, and Kundalini was always kind of in the background of all this stuff. But until I started working with Sravana on this project, it actually kind of didn't occur to me how central it was. And so, I think it was 2018 or 2019 that we kind of got together and started talking about this stuff. And it just became sort of apparent to me that I had been writing this story, all along, except that I didn't have this thing at the center of it that now in this book sort of emerged as being like the thing that ties it all together.
Okay, Sravana.
Yeah, I think Anya is right. I think it was 2018. So Kundalini in women's bodies was my PhD thesis. And until I started a PhD in the United States, I had never really heard much of the term Kundalini as a practitioner. And I became a practitioner at a very young age. So in my tradition, it was never really a front and center topic. So my journey with this topic starts, I would say now, about 2010. So we're 2025, so 15 years or so. And it really was a journey because, from not really focusing on it, it suddenly becomes this mega thing. And at that time I realized it in the United States of America. Very soon I realized it was all over the world. And so I approached Anya because while I had done my dissertation on this topic, I really truly wanted to write this book in conversation with the transmission history, which we figured was very complex. And Anya was the perfect partner for this because I could talk about from the tradition side, but I really needed her to talk about it from how it kind of coalesces with the Western tradition. So that's where we began, and here we are. And I'm going to actually show this book if you're watching the video.
If you're watching the video, then you can see the proper title said in one go. Serpent's Tail, Kundalini, the history of experience, which is, I think, really important because it kind of shows the difference between your backgrounds. And it very much comes across in the book that obviously if you listened already to my previous podcast with Sravana, you know that she has this very, very interesting experience of growing up in Assam and the tradition that we might call Kundalini, but I don't think it was called that to you, obviously. And then Anya, obviously wrote that fantastic book, Is It Yoga, amongst other things, which I still love and still recommend to people. And and the idea of this harmonial tradition and trying to find out what kind of motivates or what lies behind the phenomenon of modern yoga, and whether it is modern or whether it is something older, something more plugged in to older traditions. So I suppose the first question, the obvious place to start would be, well, where does Kundalini come in as first mentioned? Because people assume that when the tantric texts are talking about energy, they're using the word Kundalini and they're phrasing it in that way. But I think the real surprise that came in the early chapters of your book was to say that there was all these diverse ideas about Kundalini. It wasn't like one thing. I'd always thought it's one thing, it's done in a certain way. Kundalini starts at the base of the spine, goes up to the head, Sushumna Nadi, some kind of explosion, bang, you're done. But it turns out it's a little bit more complicated than that, apparently.
It actually is, and I think I'll speak to this first a little bit. It really comes down to what are we looking for in these texts. Now, if you're looking for the term Kundalini, we arrive at this about, I would say, 700, 800 Common Era, right? So 7th, 8th century. Pretty late in the context of the larger transmission history. But that does not go to say that some of these practices or some of what would then get codified as Kundalini practice or Kundalini rising, or even understood as Kundalini Shakti in this case, are to be found in earlier texts, especially say in the Vaishnava tradition. So we have to look at the Vaishnava tradition where it meant something very different. It was contextualized in a slightly different way, which is more in the lines of obstruction and so on and so forth. And then we also have to overlay this kind of history over the tantric body, because we do know when we're talking of the body in Tantra, we are not talking of just the physiological body. We are talking about a far more complex body. So it really comes down to what are we looking for, and therefore where do we land in this long historical period.
So they are, I mean, sorry to, Anya, I'm going to ask you in a second the same thing, I think, but Sravana, so they are using the term Kundalini in the 7th or 8th century. That actual word is found, is it?
Absolutely.
They do use
Yes.
it. Okay.
Yes. So, for example, in texts like the Kalottara Tantra, we will find that term. There are a few more texts, but particularly where we find Kundalini mentioned. But we do find, as I said, these practices maybe 100, 200 years prior to it, especially if we were to trace how they are approaching body and the bodily practices. So, in terms of putting a full picture, I would say very comfortably 6th century, we will have this kind of understanding of Kundalini energy documented.
And Anya, how does that go? Is there a kind of classic model, like a kind of de facto model that we can say this is the base model of Kundalini?
Well, so I think that's where it gets complicated, right? And the whole thesis of our book sort of is that there is no single Kundalini. There's sort of web, right, of concepts, practices. And I think to even expand a little bit on what Sravana was saying, so yes, right, if you're just looking for the first time that the term Kundalini shows up, we're talking, again, 7th, 8th century, something like that. And then, as she said, of course, there are these practices, whether they're physical practices or visualization practices or what have you. But I think even maybe beyond that, we want to think about concepts, right? And so, yes, Kundalini is this energy, but what does that energy look like? Is it breath? Is it fire? What's going on with the serpent? And so then if we start tracing, like, where are these pieces of what coalesces as Kundalini, where are those coming from? Then you can get plugged into all sorts of other texts, other traditions. So for instance, you could argue that Kundalini is associated with this fire in the lower half of the body, right? Which kind of like represents the fire of time. Or we could think about how serpents have had this role that's both, maybe like obstructive, right? So there's danger there, but at the same time, there is this kind of like association with immortality and with transcendence. And then, you could even expand that globally. So I think that's where you run into issues in saying that, there's sort of like one classic model. There's a model that becomes standard, which is what we argue. But especially if you kind of like, the further back you go, the more complicated the sources become. Because there really is this diversity, even in the South Asian context, of both practices and experiences. I think, as Sravana mentioned, this difference between treating Kundalini as something that's actually an obstruction within the body, right, that has to be unwound in order for, whatever the process that you're sort of like looking for before that can take place. And that's very different from what you would find in, for instance, the goddess-centric traditions, the Shakta traditions, the Kala traditions, where Kundalini is the goddess, right? It is the energy, and it is the thing that rises. Now, that maybe kind of becomes more central than what is the global narrative starting in the 19th century. But I would really push back on calling it some kind of classical model.
I believe Krishnamacharya thought it was an obstruction, I think, being, and it definitely, less glamorous, really, to think of it as an obstruction rather than thinking that it's awakening some divine serpent in you. You can see how the latter might have become more popular in a certain sense. But the idea of the serpent and and awakening something, and the idea of the obstruction are there very early on, right? That we find these in very early texts, right? Where can we go from here? I mean, maybe Anya, would you maybe, Shravana, talk a little bit more about the idea of the fire or the water? Because I remember one chapter kind of really interesting ideas about because the symbolism is often to do with the moon, isn't it? And but yet we also find the confusion of the fire coming in, or the sun, right? So I think there's a little bit of there's some kind of somewhat contradictions there in the Kundalini models, perhaps.
So I'll have Anya speak to that. I think she does a far better job of speaking about the sun and the moon. But before we get to your question, there's one thing I would also like to point out, because we don't find that in the later transmission history, is how Kundalini in certain texts, like if you were to think about the Tantra Sadbhava, which is 1100 CE or so on and so forth, Kundalini resides in the heart. And that would be a very distinctly different understanding, which actually for the first time I'd heard during my field work when I was doing my PhD. So I do want to offer, because we just spoke about the Kundalini rising, and the minute we say rising, and if we talk about fire or anything, the minute we say rising, in today's cultural narrative, it does become this one way of rising, which is from the base to up. That is again not to be understood as a standard or a way, because there are texts, there are practitioners in present times who go with the understanding that the Kundalini Shakti, may it be goddess, may it be the unborn, unceasing cosmic energy within us, it resides in the heart. So I just wanted to kind of jump in with that. Before
I don't think we're also going to maybe go a little bit down that way later, when we talk about more modern ideas about that, be it Vivekananda or other more modern Yogi Bhajan, I think, who don't look at that model at all as something that's rising in you, but rather more like a transformation of on a cellular level, which I found really, really interesting. Right, I always assumed it was a particular thing to do with the spine, but I think there was also the model of the up and down, wasn't it? The prana being brought down from the head, and the apana being brought up to the belly or around the area, and the two winds meeting each other in the middle. Right, so this is a very, very varied ideas around this. Before we forget, Anya, do you want to talk about the different symbolism around the heat and the cold and the water and the fire?
For sure. Well, and I think actually this is a good bridge. Thanks, Sravana, for bringing in that thing about the heart, because you're totally right. I mean, if we're talking about a classical model, right, like this is one really major thing that we forget about that's there in the historical material. That like forget about the bottom of the spine. It maybe is the heart, or it's the lower abdomen, or something like that. That Kundalini actually resides in. And so I think the way that we can kind of connect that to this whole, like, the deal with the water and the fire and the sun and the moon is to say that it seems like throughout the literature there is something happening within the body, within these traditions, right? There's an energy, it's the experience, right? But where that is in the body and how we describe it, what the symbolism is that we attach to all these things, right? The meaning of it really sort of varies from context to context. And so I think this whole sun, moon, water, fire thing is a really, really good example of that. And actually, especially once we expand it out beyond South Asia and we bring in maybe like the Western component into this. So yeah, I mean, even within the South Asian context, the sun and moon thing kind of maps differently throughout the body. So traditionally we would think about the sun, which is fire, right, kind of lower down in the abdomen. This is the gastric fire. This is the fire of time. The moon is closer to the crown of the head. It symbolizes that reservoir, right, of soma, of the immortal nectar. And so if you're thinking about this model that pops up pretty early on, the idea is that this nectar like drips down from the moon and it's consumed by the fire of time, by the sun, right? Of course, it's the sort of cycles of the sun that represent time. And so that's why it all sort of like works out the way that it does. You want to ultimately either stop the dripping of the nectar into the sun, or in later traditions, you actually want to bring the sun and the moon together, right? To resolve it all into sort of like cosmic oneness. But it's sort of important, right, that like the moon is at the top, the sun is at the bottom, just even in terms of how we're mapping it onto the physiology. Then you have the division between, so I think, Adam, this is what you were sort of latching onto, this idea of the up and down, the left and the right? So if we're thinking about the nadis, the ida and the pingala, right, like that also gets associated with the sun and the moon. But then it's no longer hierarchical or sort of vertical, right, like that, right? It is a little bit more of a horizontal back and forth. And then you go and look at the Western tradition, and actually it's the moon that's always associated with the bottom of the torso. This is kind of like, that feminine, chaotic element, whereas the sun is the hot, masculine thing that's kind of, the proper divine that's at the crown of the head. And so, like, all of these things exist in history, right? We can't say that one of them is somehow more accurate than the other. Like, it's just they're different models, they're different systems. And they all get mapped onto the body, and they're all used to interpret the experience in various ways, right? Like, again, there's something going on internally that people are using these images to represent. But if the images are so different, then what do we do with the experience, right? Like, is it the same experience? What does it all mean? And I think that's where it becomes really, really difficult to say that there's some kind of standard model or there's some kind of classical something, right, that we need to like get back to, right? What we have is this sort of web of things that may look pretty different from each other, but have enough overlap that they're able to kind of connect and come together.
Sharon, have you got anything to add to that?
No, I think Anya says it really beautifully, because we do have the understanding of the body that expands, with the Upanishads, right? It just kind of, there's just such an expansion and broader understanding of where the moon is in my body, where the mountains are, where are the rivers in my body. This entire nature or exterior that we are looking at becomes an interior form. But when we talk about the Kundalini, which then becomes Kundalini Yoga, and then comes the experience, we really have to come to terms with just also how the body is being understood here. What is the role? Like, if we just reverse the sun and the moon, it seems, on the face of it, not a big deal. Okay, fine. Like, you put it on the top, we'll put it on the down. But if you're a practitioner, if you're going to sit with mountains in your body, if you're going to sit with the sun and the moon in your body, if you're going to sit with the rivers in your body, my experience would be very different from someone else who now has a flipped model, right? How we are seeing the sun and the moon in this case as burning, or even then it gets coalesced with yin and yang, feminine and masculine. So much changes, the role changes, and therefore the experience will change. And that is something that really comes down to, and I'm sure we'll talk about it a little later, but it really becomes very front and center to the movement, say with, once we get to Gopi Krishna and so on and so forth. There was almost a need to explain this. And then comes the bioenergy and the evolutionary energy narrative, not to be found in any of these early texts.
I suppose we've been touching on it really, but the really fascinating thing is how it just also has a Western counterpart, right? There is this traditional model in India, which everyone's aware of, but there is like more than a little hints of it in the Western tradition, right? I mean, I think more specifically to do with that. I mean, having Jesus in the heart or a burning in the heart and this kind of thing, right? Which is undeniably to do with this energy in the body, really. Yeah. Does one of you would like to speak a little bit about that? Because that's probably my favourite chapter overall, the Oberos and the Caduceus, and how we can see these little signs in Western history. Maybe both of you have a little go at that one.
Yeah, I can take the first part of that one. It's interesting because in a sense, like the way that chapter got written was we needed to, because these symbols do become so prominent in the Kundalini narrative, in the Kundalini kind of transmission model, right, that becomes prominent starting in the 19th century. It's like we almost went backwards in a sense. It's like, okay, like everybody's representing Kundalini as the Caduceus. Let's figure out what's going on with the Caduceus, right? And so in a sense, it's a little bit like, it's like teleological, right? That these are the symbols that end up being like what we talk about in ancient history. We get there because we already know what the future is. But at the same time, yeah, I think there's something to be said about, like, there are these glimmers of people practicing and experiencing arguably similar stuff. I don't think you see it as sort of systematically worked out, especially kind of through the middle part of, kind of European history. You have all these Christian mystics that, of course, are imagining Jesus in the heart, right? And like, especially Gichtel, I think, is the great one to talk about here. So we're talking, 17th, 18th century. I mean, this guy, he's got the serpent going on. He even talks about kind of this almost like up and down movement through the body. But it's all channeled through this like very Christian language. And he's not trying to move the energy. The energy is moving. Right? I mean, again, he's having this experience that's very sort of embodied, that's clearly an energetic experience. And there's a serpent, right? And I mean, there's things that sort of look like chakras, maybe. Charles Ledbetter, once he publishes his book on the chakras in the early 20th century, latches onto this. He literally plucks an image from Gichtel's book and says, look, like, right, they had chakras in Europe too. But ultimately, yeah, I mean, like, is the Ouroboros Kundalini, right? Like, is the Caduceus Kundalini? Yes and no. And maybe ultimately more no. Right? These are their own things. They're images that symbolize something sort of very specific within their respective traditions.
With the water lilies and the lotus, doesn't it?
Yeah. In a sense, right? Yeah. So Ouroboroses and Kundalinis.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's like we find these common themes, including like actually the obstruction, right? So like the Ouroboros, for instance, yes, it symbolizes, I mean, all of reality, maybe, right? It is sort of the serpent that consumes its own tail. In the alchemical tradition, it represents how everything is ultimately one. But it could also be used as a binding symbol. This is, it's because it is sort of self-enclosed, right? In Gnostic traditions, and actually this is the way that Gichtel uses it, it's something that actually sort of traps you inside the world. And it's breaking through, right? And of course, again, the symbolism of the serpent, right, from a Christian perspective, it's breaking through that binding serpent that ultimately is the thing that allows you to sort of transcend into the abode of God or what have you. So it's this, like, I always, at least personally, vacillate. I don't know about you, Sravana, like in terms of saying whether or not, like to what extent, right, we can actually overlap these two things. Because it seems important that they're different. But the similarities are compelling too.
I think. I mean, we can't undeniably say that, just because the people are South Asian, that they have necessarily a different biological experience in the body. I think, from my lay perspective, I think it would be this, I think we're the same. I think we have the same experience, but we contextualise in a different way depending on the dogma that comes around there, surely. Yeah. I mean, what Julian of Norwich was, having in terms of the burning and the fire and the kind of experiences she was having, but obviously within that religious, as you say, language. So that's going to be very different. Although, yes, I think you make a good point that it's worked out in such depth in the South Asian traditions, which we definitely don't find that kind of almost scientific kind of language in the Western traditions. They seem to transcend rather quickly back to Jesus and everything that's happening there. Sravana.
When I talk about the serpents in the West and the serpents in the East, for me, my entry point is response to serpents. Now, in South Asia, especially if we are coming from religious and or spiritual tradition, there is a very different relationship to the serpent, right? Vasuki, like Vishnu's serpent, the serpent on Shiva, the Naga, right? So there is somewhere, and this is a term I use generously because I created this term called the socio-cultural DNA. I know scientifically there is nothing called socio-cultural DNA, but I'm sure they'll prove it at one point of time. But the socio-cultural DNA allows for a very different relationship to the serpent. It is not necessarily, serpent does not necessarily invoke fear that I sometimes find in the practitioner world. In the Western context, I know I hate saying East-West because do we really have East-West in a global world? We don't. But for this purpose of this understanding, I find people who don't have the socio-cultural DNA of the serpent to be not necessarily evil or ferocious or does not invoke that kind of emotion, plays again an enormous role in this understanding of Kundalini.
No, I mean that would be a direct contradiction to what I'm saying. That actually the very perception of the experience is different in the first place. That it's not the same experience because not even the context of interpretation, but the very experience on when it's being had is not the same thing. Yeah.
Correct. So I'll give an example, right? I was in this temple in West Bengal, and it was part of a field trip, and I had gone there during sunset. And in India, when do you ever find a temple empty? And this was Vakreshwar in West Bengal, very famous temple. And I get there at sunset, and there was no one. When I'm saying there was no one. So for a second, my heart kind of was like, oh, dang it, the temple must be closed, only to be found the temple was very much open. I'm going to cut this story short. The priest made me sit in the inner sanctum. And in Vakreshwar, there are two Shiva lingas. Vakreshwar, the devotee Shiva linga is larger and the Shiva linga is smaller. So the scale is very different. And it's inside a pit. And through this evening, he made me do pujas where I had to keep putting my hand inside the pit. Okay? At one moment, I saw a snake come up. And of course, it was a reaction. So I went back and And the priest, and yet at the same time, I knew there was no snake, but there was a snake. It was an energetic snake. The priest didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. The person next to me, I had a friend accompany me. She didn't say anything. All he told me with his eyes, continue praying. Like do the puja, not continue praying, right? Again, fast forward. We come out of the temple, and the first thing he says, you saw a Shiva visited you. And I asked why. He said, because you saw the energetic snake, right? Now, that interpretation of snake is very different from how if a snake were energetically or physically appeared in a practice scene where your relationship with the serpent is different. You would react differently. Your response to the entire experience will be 180 degrees from how I experienced Vakreshwar temple that night, sunset, nobody in the temple. And that's why this chapter is so important, because this chapter about serpents and how serpents are in the West and the East and South Asian culture, so on and so forth, really, really gets as webbed as possible, as intertwined as possible in this transmission history.
So, I mean, let's go and talk about a little bit about the methods then. We haven't really talked about, how this happens in terms of like the, you were mentioning the just doing puja and having this experience of the snake, and obviously listeners generally, ensconced in modern asana yoga, and there is this idea that for many that it's to do with the raising of Kundalini and doing yoga asana. So I suppose we should touch upon this subject as well, because of course we have latter day thinkers like Vivekananda, very almost anti-asana really, who was also mentioning this idea, but really it seemed purely meditational. It wasn't anything to do with a physical manipulation of the body, more something psychic. So I found that really interesting in the book as well, that it isn't just physical, or that it could be physical. It may just simply be meditational. And your experiences obviously were not, I assume you weren't whipping out any primary series or any kind of Surya Namaskara. You were simply sitting there with your hands in a pit. So maybe we could talk a little bit about the methodologies around this, or the diverse ways that this was said to transpire for people. Yeah. Anya, do you want to start? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just to pick up directly on the asana piece, because I think Sravana can talk about this in a sort of broader context. I mean, so even with somebody like Vivekananda, right? Like, I think we have to almost like be a little bit careful with what we think about as being physical or what we think about as being asana, right? So if we think about like a seated posture where you're practicing pranayama, where you're practicing breath work of various kinds, right? Like technically that is asana. But it's not asana in the sense of the Ashtanga primary series, right? Or even the kind of stuff that like Yogananda might have been doing.
Yeah, it's not dynamic asana. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that like from the most, let's call it like historically traditional perspective, right? So things that we see beginning in the 13th century with these Hatha Yoga traditions that are really bringing together physical techniques with kind of tantric meditative visualization techniques. I mean, we do in the various kriyas, and this is stuff that pops up again in the 20th century with various teachers. They are practicing things that certainly now we call asana. They're maybe not, again, quite as dynamic. It's not Surya Namaskar. But they are definitely ways of manipulating the physical body, of moving the physical body, that are important because they move energy in various kinds of ways. But yeah, we don't really see dynamic asana in the same way, especially being associated with Kundalini, until let's say broadly the early 20th century. I think some scholars would argue like the dynamic asana certainly develops before that, but Yeah, it's a little bit novel, actually. When we see folks like Kuvalayananda, like Shivananda, these yogis that were doing the sort of global modernizing work for postural yoga in the early 20th century, when they begin associating the physiological effects of asana with the energetic effects of kind of Kundalini practice. Right? So Kuvalayananda, for instance, says, you really want to practice asanas, even dynamic asanas that strengthen the spine, because the spine is ultimately like the place where Kundalini rises. And so you want to make sure that, that area is solid before, you engage in these higher level practices. But you don't necessarily see it discussed that way, right, until the 20th century, to the extent that there's physical techniques that are being practiced in conjunction with Kundalini. Again, the language around them is different. And then, of course, you have this whole divergence, right? As you already mentioned, Adam, you just don't see Kundalini in the same way in the Krishnamacharya tradition, for instance. And there's reasons for that, right? If you look at what's still being practiced as more that like Calcutta yoga, as Jerome Armstrong has called it in his book, the tradition that Vishnu Ghosh kind of was central to, right? But that we see through Bikram Chowdhury, that Yogananda, Paramahansa Yogananda himself was part of. Because they are very kind of like Bengali Shakta ultimately in their leanings, it's all about Kundalini, and the physical yoga, to the extent that it's practiced as asana today, is still very much about Kundalini. My own teacher was like this, and so it really sort of depends on where you look, right? To the extent that like asana practice is connected with Kundalini in particular, but I think as Sravana would say, that's really only sort of one of the methods, right?
Yeah, 100%. I think that is, if I were to quantify in terms of history, I would say that is the number of people experiencing Kundalini through the asana practice, which is this very, how we are defining asana practice, I would say is far smaller. And the greater experience of Kundalini can also just be you were sleeping. It happened through dreams. Now, dreams also is that I'm not a favor of using the term dreams, because then, you get into this whole thing of lucid dreaming, this dreaming, that dreaming, which part of the dreaming, what was your REM? Somebody will then start saying, I wore some fashionable ring that people are wearing these days to track their sleep, like it's really expensive, whatever. No, I'm not talking of that dream. Okay, let's be very clear. I'm not counting REM. I'm not wearing any gadgets of any kinds. But Kundalini as a Shakti or as an energy, both as a goddess or as an energy. When I say Shakti, I mean more goddess. And then when I say energy, it's also the energy and not necessarily understood in the goddess context, had very little to do with asana practice. So if I look at Gyanadev's Gyaneshwari, right, that is the first text where we have this elaborate step by step Kundalini rising practice. But what is he saying? He's pretty much asking you to sit on a mat and sit still. Right? It's stillness is important. But the stillness can happen while you are sleeping. The stillness can happen while you are meditating. The stillness can happen just as a stillness practice that you may be engaged with, part of asana or outside of asana. So Kundalini really, the majority in my understanding, is in a non-asana practice environment. And that's what makes it even more, for us who wrote the book, absolutely fascinating. We love the fact that you can be sitting still for 20 seconds and that can happen, right? But for someone who is, and I've been asked this question so many times, but I did not want it. I did not ask for it. And then comes permission. I did not give permission for the energy to come into me in that way. So the framework changes. How then I start putting meaning shifts.
I didn't realise that there was only a small part of the tradition that was framed around asana and bandhas and chakras and this kind of, Mahamudra, Mahaveda, Mahabandha kind of, ideas about raising the energy. But now you speak about it, it doesn't make sense, because if you look at the modern websites, like I don't know, Kundalini, and the ones that detail their Kundalini experiences, right? And usually it's just happened to the person in the modern context, right? They just suddenly just started to have this burning feeling, and as you say, they usually say they don't want it, and they're actually trying not to experience it, perhaps, or don't really know what to do with it. I suppose maybe that brings us on to Gopi Krishna. I know it's a little bit of a whistle-stop tour through the book, but obviously he is probably the person who kind of found, would it be right to say, is a kind of foundational linchpin of the modern interpretation of Kundalini? Perhaps let's have a little chat about Gopi Krishna, his experiences of Kundalini, how he certainly didn't seem to want it very much, did he? He was begging Aurobindo to help him out with it, who wasn't very kind and didn't really give him any tips at all.
No. In fact, I did not even know that the original letters and telegrams Gopi Krishna had sent, and this is the first time we are publishing them in its entirety. This has never been published before. Excerpts of it has been, but never in its entirety. And it was fascinating, Adam, just fascinating. I felt like a spy when I found this, because I was like, hold on. This date he's writing to Aurobindo, and he's just saying energy rising or something. He writes his book. Of course, many years later, the language changed. It then became like a roaring fire. It became a serpent. There were so many language shifts between when he wrote to Aurobindo, as he experienced, as he was going through this kind of breakdown of sorts, because he wanted to make meaning. And I really give credit to Anya. And Anya, I don't think you will remember this. This was back in 2016. This was not when we had even thought about doing this article, which then becomes a book. I was so upset with Gopi Krishna, because for me, it was at that time, 9 years back, I felt like he was playing, like he changed the language. He kind of, I saw him as a cop-out. I was like, you experienced it this way. Why are you now talking about it in this way? And I remember having a very animated conversation with Anya, and Anya turns around and says, but Sravana, isn't that how people process traumatic experiences? Isn't it that in the pursuit of meaning making, language comes up, and as language comes up, it's not like you're not being true to your experience. It's just that now you're explaining it to people because you have gone through the journey of meaning making. That was the day I decided I need to do this book with her, because I was like, I was so angry at him for so long, because I had gone down the rabbit hole, literally, Adam, word to word, time date to time date, date to date, situation to situation. I had started mapping and had become obsessed because I was so upset at him. And then Anya said this.
You felt that you stopped believing in what he said? Is that
I did.
No?
At that, before Anya gave me that context, I would not say I stopped believing. I felt he embellished his experience.
That's how it kind of came across in the book. I felt that he had this Western audience of the psychologist. I can't remember the name of the couple. The people he was corresponding, the Westerners he was corresponding with. And it seemed like he was kind of rather giving them the kind of language and experience that they might have wanted. Let's say so.
Right.
I wasn't 100% on his experiences until then. Obviously, he starts speaking loads of languages that he doesn't even know how to speak, and then. That seems to suggest that he obviously experienced something after all.
Yeah.
Well, and the thing is, I think, Sravana, I do remember that actually, that conversation. Well, and I think that was kind of an important processing moment for me too, right? Because as we were talking through this, and I think Gopi Krishna was where this project started. That was going to be the article. Originally, we were only going to look at Gopi Krishna, and then it kind of occurred to us you can't explain what's happening with him without, going over 2,000 years of history, at least. But, but even just reading, actually, to me, by the end of it, having gone through all those documents, having sort of myself retraced what Sravana just described, again, like mapping, date to date, word to word, what stood out to me by the end of that wasn't the ways in which he diverged from the original experience in the subsequent published account. It was actually how close the two ended up being, given that they were written, over a decade apart. The language changes. Yes, there's, a fiery serpent zigzagging through his body by the end of it. But actually, aside from these details that, I think some of it maybe is just marketing, right, to a particular audience. But I think some of it is also him picking up this language. As a result of trying to figure out what it was that was happening to him. Just the language gets more specific, right? Yeah, maybe it gets a little bit more extreme or, right? The images are more concrete in some ways. But if you go to the core of it, just even from the letters and the telegrams that he sends to Aurobindo, it's clear something is happening with the guy.
Absolutely.
Right? There's no question that...
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
He is having an experience.
Yeah. Yeah, and it also seems clear that Aurobindo hasn't had that experience at all, although his books would kind of almost suggest otherwise. I always really felt that Aurobindo was speaking from a personal experience of having had this process happen to him. But it definitely seemed that, unless it did later, that it hadn't, nothing of that sort had happened to him by the time that he received those letters.
Adam, I disagree, actually, on that one.
Oh, really?
I believe that Aurobindo did have a similar, if not a lot of experiences. Aurobindo, by this time when Gopi Krishna wrote to him, had carved a very different path as an Aurobindo, and the mother Miralfas had already come into the picture. So their path was very carved and very set in a particular way. So having read, as I said, I really got so obsessed. So having read Aurobindo's accounts, if we look at it earlier accounts and then we look at it later accounts, I would say Aurobindo absolutely had, I don't want to say Kundalini experience because he doesn't say it's a Kundalini, so that would be like projecting, but he did have, going back to where we started, what do we call it? What are we looking for? If we don't name it Kundalini for Aurobindo, he had 100% those experiences and awakening, like faint when he saw, there's this one incident where, as a child, he sees a fleet of white swans flying in a cloudy sky, and he's in a paddy field, and he faints. And he has these experiences. So if I were to map experiences, this is pretty much what we're talking about, right? But he refuses to help Gopi Krishna because I think, and I firmly believe, by this time, he had a very different approach to, his way of, as humankind, we are evolving. Evolution is not ended. There are many more levels to do this. We have to go on from level 1 to level X or Y. So I think it would have been very contradictory
to integral yoga,
his defined path. So that's kind of what I have come to understand. Yeah.
I think also, again, it was worth pointing out that the model isn't just, it's hard not to be so blinded by the traditional fiery model that there's something particular that happens to you at a certain time. It's definitely Kundalini.
Right.
It's done in this way rather than just it could just be a change of mindset. It doesn't have to be this whole embodied experience which is overwhelming. I mean, like Gopi Krishna definitely paints this classic model where you're kind of writhing and it's burning and stinging and everything, everything's happening, and it's that's Kundalini. And I think that's definitely the model that I had in my mind, and I think probably a lot of the audience do. And rather than you just from that you see the swans faint, and from that moment on something has happened, something has changed. It's a perceptual shift, which I think perhaps brings us to the more of the modern context again, when again we talk about figures like Vivekananda and Yogananda. They're not done any physical yoga. It's not very physical. It doesn't seem with them. It's a very visceral experience, right? That's how I understood it anyway. When they're talking about it, it's more like a cellular change,
Yes. If I may just take another 30 seconds here. One of the women gurus in Assam, when I had interviewed her, and I love what she says, and I say this to, I do public facing retreats and workshops, and I say this quite often now. Now call it Kundalini, call it something else, call it just fainting, whatever, right? But what she said is, once you've had that experience, once your cellular, just as you said, once your cellular body has gone through that frequency change, the dial never turns back. It's a permanent change. It's a permanent transformation. It's a permanent dial shift, and that is what then gets into a very varied way of explaining. So for Gopi Krishna, he will get into biofuel, evolutionary energy. He does a lot of work with, what is it called, the Institute of Consciousness Research or something, Institute of Research for Consciousness, something to that effect. I think I'm saying something wrong here, but it then changes from there. But it is that cellular change that happens. 1, 2, you cannot dismiss it. 3, it never goes back to what it was before that.
Yeah, and when we hear kind of people like Adyashanti or amongst others, Muji, there's someone in England called Tony Parsons. It's usually happening when they're out cycling, having a walk, and it's nothing to do with something rising or burning or heating. It's just like they have a mindset change, which from that moment on, I mean, Tony Parsons always said, I used to go and see him speak. It was no longer Tony Parsons. He'd be just walking in the park, and suddenly he just kind of lost his sense of his being an individual self, altogether. So I suppose that kind of thing would also transpire in the end, as we could call it Kundalini shift in terms of a DNA, almost a kind of like mind, like chemical mind change that was irreversible happening to someone.
100%.
Yeah. I mean, do you want to speak, or maybe let's go on and talk about in the 20th century and a little bit later, people like Yogi Bhajan and more the global context as we draw to the conclusion of our chat. I know that you wanted to speak about how this has fructified in the modern context, and now when we talk about Kundalini, everyone's rubbing their hands together, when's the sex part happening? When are we going to talk about all that? And so let's talk about that, and then maybe also, Sravana, you can mention your background in Assam and a temple would be super interesting. That chapter at the end was obviously very eye-opening. So Anya, do you want to start the Kundalini in the global context?
Yeah. Well, I guess maybe just to bring it full circle and come back to the title of the book, right? I mean, to us, it was very important that there was that comma between, right? So it's the serpent's tail, Kundalini, comma, yoga, comma, and the history of an experience. Specifically because, right, when people think or they hear Kundalini Yoga today, it's immediately Kundalini Yoga as taught by Yogi Bhajan, right? Because that is the brand. And so there's actually, if you read the preface, it's like, we have these sections that are like, a couple of pages in that are basically like what this book is not about. And the first subheader there is, this book is not about, Yogi Bhajan's Kundalini Yoga, right? Of course, obviously that's part of the narrative, as it has to be, but yeah, it's so much bigger than that. And I think the second subheader there is, this book is not about sex, right? Which is to say it's not about Neo-Tantra. Even though that too is part of the narrative. And so, yeah, I think that's where kind of in the 20th century context, on the one hand, because we have access to so much more data, and especially now, if you go on social media or you go wherever, people are talking about like Kundalini all over the place. So there's sort of an explosion of diversity from that perspective. But on the other hand, it's like, that's why we sort of started out trying to write this book as almost like kind of a pushback against the idea that there's a standard narrative, right? Like there is this tendency to come back to, kind of the assumptions that we all have. Yes, it's this fiery thing. It rises, from the bottom of the spine to the top. And that's the only thing that Kundalini can be, right? Our whole point was like, no, like look at all this other stuff. Even if you go back 1,000 years, it's already so diverse. And so, yeah, I think what I would say about that kind of 20th century context is that it's interesting to watch how these different teachers, like Yogi Bhajan, like all the kind of Shaktipat gurus, so we talk about Muktananda, we talk about Amrit Desai, Kripalu, that whole lineage. All of them, in a sense, it's almost like they're competing, right, for their like market share of like what is the proper take on Kundalini? What's the best method to handle this? Is it through kind of like a very specific regimen of physical practice? Do you need a guru, right? Do you need a teacher that's actually going to sort of channel this for you? Yeah. And so, yeah, I think that's where it gets like even trickier in a sense, because there is this sort of like both an insistence on, there's one proper method, there's one proper model, but also just if you look across the landscape of what's out there, it becomes very clear that like, well, there's not one model, right? Because here's like 5 different guys saying, I've got the one model.
And they also say, my model is better than the others.
Yes,
Some actually go ahead and quote others. They actually are like, they go on record and say, his model is wrong, my model is better, they are doing it wrong. So yeah, it really, but before I speak to this, I think what I do want to, emphasize, and I feel very, very strongly about this, is this notion of East-West, or the notion of appropriation versus appreciation, the notion of who borrowed from whom, therefore who owns. Clearly, in the context of Kundalini, it is not owned by anyone. It is, if we are going with the Shakti, it is not owned by anybody, right? But very quickly, it does become a product, and the comma goes missing between Kundalini and Yoga, and it becomes Kundalini Yoga. And in this, while yes, there were people who were non-South Asians in this context, who played a role, who did take on this practice. Theosophists did their thing, Jung did his thing, everybody was doing their thing. So non-South Asian is definitely, kind of pulled things out of the practice and kind of brought it to the world. But I think what we do not speak enough about is there was also an equal, if not a louder response from the South Asians. They were providing the translations. they were some of the teachers who came as immigrants and taught these practices and removed the comma and called it Kundalini Yoga. And so it's very unfair to lay the blame solely on the non-South Asians. I think this was like a collective movement of sorts where there was demand in the culture, demand in the society. People were looking for a more defined way of either rising the energy or the energy is risen, so I want to work with the energy or to have an experience. There was definitely a demand, and both groups of people came together, and then there was this and it became a capitalist product in the market. You signed up for a product in the market, and that's what it came down to.
Which is funny because Gopi Krishna's explanations didn't sound that attractive, really. I mean, when he's talking about it, it's not something you'd want to purchase, really, rather avoid. But latter day Yogi Bhajan experiences it very differently. He's talking a little bit more like in Vivekananda terms, as I understood it, more as a kind of a cellular transformation that happens rather than any particular rising. No, that it's a kind of energetic overhaul or evolution, I think is the words that you use in the text. Yeah.
I mean, I think well, part of that is due to like he is ultimately marketing this method, right? And it's, I think for me, when I look at what Yogi Bhajan has going on, it's this kind of balancing act of, on the one hand, in order to make the method approachable, in order to make the method a method for householders, right, as he says, this is for regular people. This is not for, ascetics that are going to completely transform their consciousness such that they can't operate in the world anymore. Like, it needs to have that kind of like accessibility to it, right? On the other hand, I mean, Yogi Bhajan's coming from a Sikh background, right? And so far as, I mean, yes, he's bringing in all these elements of Tantra, but actually, I mean, if you want to talk about kind of sociocultural DNA, even though he's South Asian, he's coming from a very different place than somebody like Vivekananda or Yogananda or even Gopi Krishna. And so within the Sikh tradition, I mean, you would talk about these things differently, in the same way that within the Krishna tradition, right? I mean, we have energy, but you manipulate it in different ways. And so I think it's both something that, it's a marketing tactic maybe, but also, I mean, insofar as there's something genuine for him at the core of it, I think it is coming from sort of a different way of experiencing the world and a different way of experiencing energy.
I think we can't skip over to conclude Shravana's chapter at the end. Well, I don't know, I don't really got words to describe the kind of experiences in the Assam temple, but they did seem a little bit more esoteric, and they did seem somewhat sexually based, if I may say so. Do you just want to? I don't know whether it would be the end note, but certainly it's a fascinating view into a very different world. If you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit of that with us.
It was a chapter that we debated quite a bit to include or not include. I will be upfront about it, and I did because I promised some of my interlocutors that I will not be afraid and I will bring their stories out. And that was a promise I made, and hence I got the access I got. Now, much as we have spoken about Kundalini as energy, so on and so forth, spontaneously rising, or you want to kind of raise it in a much more structured way. There are so many different options. Much as we said, this book is not about sex, and we absolutely didn't want to get into Neo-Tantra and orgasms and so on and so forth. Much as we said all of this, the fact of the matter also is that while in Shakta, and I'm talking of Shakta Tantra practices in the northeast of India, because when I say Tantra, Sri Vidya traditions may be very different, and so it's very important to demarcate that I'm talking of comfortably, I can say the Himalayan belt. So if I'm talking of Tantra in the Himalayan belt, they may not brand it, and I will include the bowels in it too. They may not brand it as Kundalini, because as I said, that is not how the practice sees it. But if we were to overlay the bodily practices, yes, the energy either spontaneously coming in and awakening you, or you're now going to work with this energy. There are certain very specific bodily practices that practitioners engage in. And the reason I have come to understand in the last 15 years or so of researching this actively, the reason I believe is because then it gives you, like an asana practice, a discipline. It gives you a cadence. Your physical body becomes a vessel that has the capacity to work, to house this very, very powerful energy. So it's not so much about going from point A to B or C, but getting your physical body and your energetic body trained to house, host, and cultivate this energy. And that's where these practices, some which we have mentioned pretty vividly, we didn't use any censorship there. We were like,
no, yeah, that's a, how do you say it? That's a teaser for reading the book. Get to the end of the book, go with finally those vivid descriptions that we all wanted. Yeah.
And there was a trick to that as well. One was we debated so much if we wanted it or not. Two, anytime I am a very impatient reader, so I always read the last chapter first. Even if it's a murder mystery, I will always read the last chapter first. Then I will sincerely read the whole sequence, because I cannot wait for the big murder to be solved, right? And so that was another thing. I was like, okay, that's at the end. Start with the end.
It was a wonderful end. I mean, a fantastic book, and we've hardly done it justice here. I mean, it is a really fantastic read, and it really just goes from the early part. I mean, we haven't even talked about Jung and the unconscious, loads of other stuff in there, totally accessible. Yeah, I loved it. One of the best things I've read for years, in fact. I really, really enjoyed it. So thanks, guys, for coming on. Anya Foxen, Sravana Borkataky-Varma. I've tried to attempt. I failed at getting your name at the last hurdle. I said I would never say your name again, and I failed again. But at least I tried. Anyways, Sravana, Anya, thanks so much for coming on. And do really check out the book. I love the book, The Serpent's Tale. Much. If you ever thought that Kundalini was just one thing, you're in for a surprise. It's just so varied, and you really do it. You open my eyes to it anyway. So, thanks, guys, for your time. And we'll put the links in the show notes to the book and to other information on it. All right. Cheers.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Adam.
you.
Thank you. Truly appreciate it.